Welcome everyone to Group 5's presentation on unit testing, being presented by Benjamin Karleski, Catherine Hobbs, Rex Nesbitt, and Bud Wortham.
Hi, this is Benjamin Karleski, and I'm talking to you today about unit testing. So to start off with, we're going to start with what is unit testing. Unit testing is the practice of testing individual components that make up a system in as much isolation as possible. When you're looking to identify what is a unit, consider the smallest independent piece of code that could be tested. This can be difficult in very highly coupled systems. And so if you can start programs with unit testing, it becomes much easier at the beginning and facilitates what is a best practice, which is developing very loosely coupled systems. When you consider how to test unit tests, you need to remember that unlike functional tests, they often don't map directly to larger business requirements. We're not testing how well the sum of the components work together to achieve an end goal, but rather if each step in the process is doing its part correctly. As such, the person creating the test is often the developer, technical designer, or someone very familiar with the code. In any case, they need to be aware of and familiar with how the individual component is being expected to act. To facilitate the testing of a single component, tests often try to simulate other surrounding bits of code. This is often referred to as mocking these other types of code. This can be especially helpful when your code is interacting with things like a database or a web service. As unit test is focused on making sure individual units are doing what they should, effort should be invested to make sure the test covers as many scenarios as possible. All lines of code should ideally be exercised, but this will generally produce a large amount of tests. So often these tests are automated, creating additional code which exercise the production units of code. A lot of development tools have ways to quickly and effectively run unit tests regularly, and that can help developers know of problems early on, and it helps when you're trying to refactor things so that you can clean up internal logic while maintaining the original interface.
Hello, I'm Rex Nesbitt, and I'm going to discuss the advantages in unit testing. There are four main reasons I'm going to focus on and cover and explain why unit testing is beneficial to implement in the process of software development. First, to make unit testing possible, the code needs to be modular. This means that the code is easier to reuse. Unit testing allows for higher quality of code because it is more efficient and maintainable to work with in changes. It also acts as a documentation for the project through the development process, since each test can serve as a reference as the project progresses. Debugging is easier with unit testing. When a test fails, only the latest changes need to be debugged, as opposed to testing at higher levels where changes are made over a span of several days, weeks, or months, then they would need to be scanned and debugged. Unit testing is also cheaper or more cost-effective. The defects found at these early stages cost very little to debug compared to the cost of time, effort, and failures of a defect detected during other testing phases or when the software is being finalized. Lastly, unit testing influences better design. Developing tests forces the developer to think through the code and recognize what it must accomplish, thus resulting in well-defined code with high cohesion. To summarize, the benefits of unit testing is high quality of code that is reliable, reusable, easier to debug, and more agile in the ability to make changes throughout development.
Hi everyone, my name is Bud Wortham and I will be discussing the cost, cons, and disadvantages of unit testing. Let me begin by talking about the cost. The main cost that comes from unit testing is a large amount of code. For every function or unit, there will also be a unit test to make sure that the code is functioning properly. Now, with the code and the unit test, we're also going to need a large form of version control. This needs to be implemented to keep track of every change to the code, unit test, and system. The cons of unit testing are simply we need to figure out what we need to test and how we're going to test it. This can be difficult if the function or unit is very confusing. And if it's confusing, this makes fixing the code even more difficult. In The Mythical Man Month by Frederick Brooks, Brooks outlines the main disadvantage by writing, "Never go to sea with 2 chronometers. Take 1 or 3. This means that code and unit tests are not enough. Another form of testing should be implemented. This is because the unit test itself may be bugged or may have issues. They also don't check when things are integrated together. And since they only test the smallest function possible, it misses testing the entire system."
Unit testing can be very effective. Here are a few points of when you might want to use unit testing. These are only a few of the many points that exist, but I feel like they are very key essential to unit testing. One of the functions of unit testing is that it makes you think about the problem before you actually begin coding, which can lead to the improved quality of code. Because unit testing is performed on the code before integration ever happens, any bugs can be resolved early in the implementation process. This point is similar to finding bugs early in that unit testing can reduce defects in newly developed features or reduce bugs when changing the existing software. The debugging process is pretty straightforward in that if the test fails, it means that the most recent changes is probably where the program needs to be debugged. Unit testing can really be beneficial in that it helps you think through your design and help you to focus as you create better designs. If you can easily define what the code is responsible for, it means that your section of code is well defined and has high cohesion. I think that this point kind of sums everything up in that it reduces costs. And this point ties for example, directly into the debugging process and finding bugs early, because if you can fix those bugs easily and immediately, this could lead to lower costs later on in the development process.